you have a new Amazon piece out that I definitely want to dive into because one, it's newsworthy and it's timely, but two, it's dystopian and oddly, darkly hilarious in its own way as well. But first, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the background for this because, you know, there people might who watch the show have heard of Chris Smalls. They've heard of this Amazon effort for a few years now, but like I think the unionization effort that is. I think like telling a brief summary of where it started to where it is now is useful just to get people to remind people of really how this was a David versus Goliath situation and how this started due to the fact that Amazon was not respecting its employees' health concerns and safety concerns at the start of the pandemic in April. And that's really where this started in Staten Island, I guess, specifically. And now 2 years later, it's been this massive success. So do you mind just giving a quick bit of background on the Staten Island unionization effort or success now?
Sure. So what's interesting about what Chris Smalls is saying is in his tweets and his statements, he said, if Amazon had just given us a little bit earlier, we wouldn't be asking for all this stuff later now that we are, but they forced us to because they wouldn't give us a little bit earlier. And that little bit was in 2020 during the onset of the pandemic. One of his coworkers came down sick with COVID, and he and other workers in the warehouse, I think at the fulfillment center in Staten Island, were concerned about the lack of safety protocols. I've been reporting on Amazon for a number of years now, and I got all sorts of tips from people at fulfillment centers, just like he was at, saying that their bosses were not making reasonable accommodations for them to, for example, social distance, or to have workers come in at certain times so that you don't have everyone standing shoulder to shoulder and creating the conditions for spreading this terrible illness. And so when his friend came down sick, that was sort of like the straw that broke the camel's back, and he and a few coworkers took part in a walkout just asking for basic workplace protection so they wouldn't catch COVID. And he was fired as a result of that. And what was extraordinary about that is that after he was fired, that's really the genesis of this whole union effort. It sounds like, they would have been fine to just have the, like you said, the little bit early, just these reasonable accommodations so they don't get sick. And once he was fired, it's like, well, might as well go for it. Let's try to unionize this thing. And it was unusually vitriolic the way that Amazon went after him. So an internal memo leaked from senior management, including Jeff Bezos, took part in a meeting where they said, this young man, he's about 33 years old, he's black. They said, and they made a statement saying, we want to make this guy the face of the movement because he will discredit it because he's, I'm trying to remember what the wording was. This memo was published by Vice News. It was, he's inarticulate and not well spoken. And, people can make of that what they will. It sounds to me like there's a certain, racial overtones to how they're saying those things. And lo and behold, that guy that they thought was inarticulate and I think they said not particularly smart, he ends up pulling off the biggest upset in terms of labor victories in decades. The former chief labor correspondent for the New York Times said this was the most stunning labor victory I've seen in my entire career. He's been covering these things for like 40 years.
Yeah, and it's that's such a striking detail in comparison to, like, I was reading a piece in The Prospect where they interviewed a bunch of the organizers who worked with Chris, between how they describe Chris, his fellow employees, as, one of the best employees there, and how it was a shock to the system that he was fired, versus how the corporate structure describes him, which is like filled with contempt, in derision, dismissiveness, racism, and just like plain disconnection from their employees altogether. Because if they knew how he was perceived in the Staten Island Center, they I don't know, they maybe wouldn't have made that move, although maybe they're arrogant enough to do so anyway. Yeah,
it's really striking. I should point out too that he had managed to unionize this independently without the support of an established union. And so, if they had succeeded in unionizing with an experienced union of the sort that is helping the folks in the fulfillment center in Bessemer, Alabama, and are getting really close, but did not have the blowout that Smalls and his group did in Long Island, that in itself would be an amazing accomplishment. But to do it with no established union backing, the money and experience that brings with it is really extraordinary.
100%. And you mentioned some of your other reporting on Amazon plants. I just want to remind people that this is not, the only reporting that you've done on Amazon as well. In December 2021, there was a tornado that killed 6 workers in Illinois, and you spoke to some people about how they basically got zero emergency training. If you don't mind just talking about that, because I do think it paints a broader picture about Amazon's practices.
Yeah, so in that story, I spoke with a former Amazon, it was a safety expert. She had worked in public safety for a number of years, and so she was familiar with what tends to be the processes in industrial facilities and workplaces. And she said that by and away, this was the worst that she'd ever experienced. And like you said, they didn't have protocols in place for, in the event of an extreme weather event, what kind of best practices in place for what to do. And these, in addition to that, it sounds like the warehouses are not built in such a way that it's going to provide workers the protection they need in those kind of situations, which is going to only be more and more of a concern as climate change increases the extreme weather events. And so after speaking to her, I was sort of surprised by that, because I figured I didn't think Amazon was going to be great, but I figured maybe they'd be more or less like the rest of the sort of workplaces that people go into. And so I started interviewing other people. They told similar stories of fires going on and not being evacuated for, in some cases, I think it was like a couple hours before they even were taken out of the facility in Phoenix, Arizona, if I remember correctly. And so I just kept hearing more and more stories like this. That's the theme of all of the reporting that I've done in this, is thinking I have some sense of that it's not great, and then realizing, whoa, it's significantly worse than I thought.
Yeah, and just my main takeaway from that, and also just Chris's initial firing, is like, he was fired in April 2020 for making these complaints about COVID. Do people remember what we knew about COVID in April 2020? I think a lot of people, we eventually masked, but that must have been maybe a week before the masks were recommended at a certain point. Like, in March, I was still going to the drugstore with gloves on at the start to pick out groceries. I mean, there was not even an understanding of how the virus was spread. And so that's how quickly Amazon forced its workers back into working under these conditions with very, very little knowledge about what the virus was and how their safety would be impacted. So just, that paired with your other stories just shows how worker safety is not even there's barely a priority there. If not, there's zero priority taken.
Yeah, the strategy of the company is to just, get the most productivity out of a worker that you can and discard them. I mean, that's literally the strategy of the company. They don't intend for you to work there for, like workplaces of the past. You talk to somebody who worked for Ford in the 1950s. It could be a lifetime union job they could look forward to. Amazon's fine if you want to come in and work on a part-time basis for a year as a contractor, and then you leave. That's their business strategy.